The hatchlings smelled the station before the ship even docked. All three of them pressed against the inner hull, their claws scraping slow. Lines into the metal, their nostrils flaring wide. They could smell fuel and rust and the bodies of 100 different species packed into one spinning ring of metal in the middle of nowhere. They could smell fear, old and new. They could smell something else too, something they had no word for yet, because they were young and the universe was still mostly a mystery to them. Dracal watched them from the cockpit doorway and said nothing. He had spent 40 years learning when to speak and when to simply let things be. This was a letting things be moment. The hatchlings were restless after 3 weeks in transit. They needed space and air and something to push back against. He needed fuel cells and a replacement coolant coil before the port engine failed completely. Neither of them was going to get exactly what they wanted today. That was how most days worked. Station Vardon filled the cockpit window as the autopilot brought the ship in slow. It was not a beautiful station. It had been built in pieces over a long time by too many different species with too many different ideas about what a station should look like, and the result was a structure that looked like someone had attached several accidents to each other and declared it functional. Pipes ran along the outside that had no clear purpose. 2 of the outer docking rings were different sizes. A section near the south hub was still patched with emergency foam from an incident 6 years ago that nobody on the station liked to talk about. But it had fuel. It had parts. It had enough species moving through it. That 1 warrior and 3 dragon hatchlings would not be the strangest thing anyone saw that week. Probably. The docking clearance came through in 4 languages, which was standard for Vardon. Dracal answered in his own and guided the ship manually into the restricted bay they had assigned him. He had asked for restricted. He had been very clear about that in his initial contact. He did not want foot traffic near the hatchlings. He did not want curious passers-by pressing their faces to the bay windows. He did not want a situation. He had spent the last 8 months trying very hard not to have a situation. It had not always worked. The bay doors sealed behind him with a sound like a slow exhale. Dracal powered the ship down in stages and stood in the resulting quiet for a moment. Cinder had moved to the portside panel and was pressing her nose against the small round window that looked out into the bay. Grail was sitting in the middle of the floor watching Dracal with that steady, patient look that always made him feel like the hatchling understood more than it should. Voss was still at the hull, still scraping, slower now, the restlessness working itself out. Dracal moved through the ship and opened the inner cargo door that connected to the hatchlings section. He did not call to them. He simply opened the door and stepped back, and they filed out around him the way they always did. Voss first, always Voss first, head low and eyes scanning, then Cinder close behind, and then Grail last, taking its time. He had raised them from eggs. He had watched them crack open in the cold stone chambers of the breeding ground on his home world, one by one, in the pale, early light. He had been there because their rider had asked him to be there. Their rider had been young, barely trained, full of a kind of bright-eyed certainty that older warriors either admired or resented, depending on how much of their own certainty they had used up. He had asked Dracal to witness the hatching because he had no family to bring, and he wanted someone to witness it. Dracal had witnessed it. And then, 14 months later, he had witnessed the other thing too. He did not think about that if he could avoid it. He was good at not thinking about things. It was one of the skills that 40 years in service had given him that he had never asked for and could not return. The hatchlings explored the bay. It was empty except for his ship and some wall-mounted equipment that they sniffed and then ignored. Voss found a loose panel near the floor and pulled at it experimentally. Cinder circled the ship twice and then sat and looked up at the docking lights. With her head tilted, Grail walked to the center of the bay, lay down, and went to sleep. Dracal stepped out of the ship and went to speak to whoever was in charge. The station commander was a broad, tired-looking human named Holst who had the manner of someone who had been managing crises for so long that his face had stopped registering them. He looked at Dracal's credentials, looked at the restricted bay assignment, and looked at the maintenance request. He said, "The hatchlings stay in the bay." Dracal said, "Yes." Holst said, Any incident involving them any at all, and I invoke. Docking Clause 7, and you leave within the hour. Clear. Drakal said. Clear. Holst nodded and sent the maintenance request down the line. He looked like he was already thinking about something else before Drakal had even turned to leave. There were perhaps 40 humans on Vardon, by Drakal's rough count as he walked back through the station corridors. They were a common enough species at this part of the transit lanes. He had fought alongside a few of them in the Second Border War and found them to be, on the whole, reasonable soldiers, adaptable, more durable than they looked, prone to making decisions based on feeling rather than calculation, which was sometimes a problem and sometimes, unexpectedly, the exact right thing. He did not dislike humans. He simply did not think about them very much. The maintenance worker arrived at the bay 40 minutes later. Drakal heard the outer door code being entered and was already on his feet, already moving to position himself between the door and the hatchlings. The door opened. The human who walked in was not what Drakal had expected, though he could not have said what he had expected exactly. The man was average in height, with the kind of face that did not make strong first impressions, not young, not old, somewhere in the middle of things. He was wearing a worn work suit with a station patch on the shoulder and carrying a tool bag that had clearly been repaired more than once. He had grease on one hand already, which suggested he had come from another job, or simply that he was the kind of person who was always in the middle of something. He looked at the ship. He looked at Drakal. He looked at the three hatchlings who had all gone very still and were now staring at him with eyes that had begun to glow faintly at the edges, pale gold, the color they went when they were deciding something. He said, I'm Reeve. Maintenance. I'm here for the coolant coil and whatever else is on the list. He did not take a step back. He did not reach for anything. He just stood there, tool bag in hand, and waited. Voss made a sound low in its throat. Grail, who had been asleep, opened one eye. Drakal said, carefully, you should be aware that the hatchlings are not restrained. Reeve looked at the three hatchlings again. Then he looked back at Drakal. He said, okay, in a tone that suggested this was information he was filing away rather than panicking about. Then he walked toward the ship. Drakal stood very still and watched. He had seen beings of a dozen species react to unrestrained hatchlings. He had seen soldiers freeze. He had seen diplomats run. He had seen a Kreth border guard, famous among his own people for fearlessness, make a sound like a small animal and press himself flat against a wall. This human walked to the ship with a steady, unhurried step, set his tool bag down beside the port engine housing, and crouched to look at the coolant coil. All three hatchlings watched him. None of them moved. Drakal did not understand what he was seeing, but he stayed where he was and kept watching, because something was happening here that he did not have a word for yet, and he had learned, in 40 years, that those were usually the moments worth paying attention to. Voss moved first. That was always how it went. In every encounter, in every new place, in every situation where something unknown had entered the space the three of them occupied, Voss moved first. Not always toward, not always away, but first and fast, and with that particular energy that sat right on the edge between curiosity and aggression, a line so thin that most beings who had ever stood on the wrong side of it had not lived to describe the difference. Voss crossed the bay floor in 4 steps and put its face approximately 6 inches from Reeve's left ear. Reeve was in the middle of reading a pressure gauge on the coolant coil housing. He stopped reading. He did not turn his head. He did not make a sound. He simply went still, not the frozen stillness of fear, but the deliberate stillness of someone who had just understood something important and was taking a moment to think about it. Drakal was across the bay with one hand already raised, a command word for Voss forming in his throat. He held it. Something made him hold it. Reeve exhaled, long and slow, through his nose. He turned his head very gradually until he was looking at Voss, and then, instead of holding that eye contact the way most beings did, the way that always read is a challenge, he looked away, down and to the side, like he was checking something on the floor. Voss stayed exactly where it was. Drakal watched this without breathing. In the language of young score dragons, Direct eye contact held too long. Meant, I am deciding whether you are a threat. Breaking that eye contact. And looking down meant something closer to, I am not competing with you. It was not submission exactly. It was more like a door left open rather than pushed through. Drakal had never seen a human do it. He was not certain this human knew. He was doing it. It looked, from the outside, like a man who simply felt more comfortable looking at the floor than at the creature that could remove his head without significant effort. Voss sniffed the side of his head. Once. Twice. A slow investigation. Then it pulled back and walked 3 paces away and sat down and began cleaning its front claws the way it did when something had been decided and found unimportant. Drakal lowered his hand. Reeve went back to reading the pressure gauge. He did not look at Drakal. He did not say anything about what had just happened. He simply found his place on the gauge and continued working. And the only sign that anything out of the ordinary had occurred was that his exhale, when it came, was slightly longer than the one before. Cinder came next. She was the more cautious of the 3 in new situations, which people always found surprising because she was also the largest, larger than Voss by about 1/3, built broader through the shoulder, with a heavier ridge of scales along her spine that caught the bay light and made her look almost copper-colored. She approached the tool bag rather than the human, which was her way. She investigated objects first, the things a being chose to carry with them, as if an inventory of someone's tools told her more than their face. She knocked the bag over. It hit the bay floor and spilled open wrenches, calibration rods, a flat sensor pad, several things that rolled. Drakal waited for the human to react. Most beings reacted to sudden loud noises with some combination of jumping and swearing. Reeve watched the tools spread across the floor. Then he started picking them up, one at a time. He held each one up briefly before putting it back in the bag, and he said the name of it under his breath as he did. Not loudly, not performing anything, just the quiet habit of a person who sorted things by naming them. Pressure wrench, calibrator, sensor pad, 8-ring socket, 8-ring socket, another 8-ring socket, which is too many, but here we are. Cinder watched this process with complete attention. When the last tool was back in the bag, she sniffed the bag again, the same careful twice over as Voss had given the human's head. Then she sat beside it, not on it, just beside it, as though she had assigned herself to keep watch over it, and was taking that assignment seriously. Reeve glanced at her, and then back at the coolant coil, and said nothing. Grail was the one Drakal worried about least and most at the same time. Least because Grail was the quietest of the 3, the one who observed before it acted, the one who sometimes simply chose not to engage with things that didn't interest it enough. Most because when Grail did act, it acted with a certainty the other 2 didn't always have, a decisiveness that came from having thought the thing through first. Grail walked from the center of the bay to approximately 2 feet behind Reeve's left shoulder and then sat down. That was all. It did not sniff him. It did not investigate his tools. It simply positioned itself behind him and watched the back of his head and the movement of his hands while he worked. Reeve worked for a while in this arrangement. The hatchlings around him, and the large score warrior on the far side of the bay who had still not said anything and was starting to wonder if he had been standing so still for so long that his legs would complain about it later. Then Reeve said, without turning around, "Is it supposed to be watching me, or is that normal?" Drakal said, "Which one?" "The one behind me." "That is Grail." "It is." Drakal paused. He was not sure how to translate what Grail was doing into something a human would understand. "It has decided you are interesting enough to observe. This is not a threat." "Okay," Reeve said. "Then, is it normal for them to decide that? About a stranger?" Drakal considered lying. It would have been easy. He could have said, yes, they were simply curious creatures. This happened with everyone. He could have ended the line of questioning before it required him to explain something he did not fully understand himself. He said, "No." Reeve nodded slowly, like this confirmed something he had suspected but not been sure about. He went back to the coolant coil. After a few minutes he said, "The coil is cracked at the 3rd junction. I can seal it as a temporary fix, but you'll want a replacement before you go past light 4. You've also got a fuel cell imbalance on the starboard side and something wrong with your NAV guidance calibration that I want to look at tomorrow, if that's all right. Drakal said it was all right. Reeve began the seal work. Grail watched every movement of his hands. Voss had moved again, circling around to the front of the ship and then back, the long, restless circuit it always made when it was processing something. Cinder remained beside the tool bag. None of them made a threatening sound. None of them came any closer than they already had. Drakal crossed the bay and stood a few meters to the left of Reeve, which put him close enough to intervene if something changed. He looked at the hatchlings and then at the human working between them, and he said, because the question had been building in him since the moment the bay door had opened, "What did you do?" Reeve looked up. With what? When Voss approached you. What did you do? What technique? Reeve appeared to think about this. Then he said, I read something once. A long time ago. Pamphlet about working near non-domestic fauna. It said, if something big gets in your face, don't stare at it and don't run. Look away and breathe slow. He paused. I remembered it. I don't know if that's what I was doing exactly. It was more that running seemed like a bad idea, and I needed to do something with my face. Drakal looked at him. Reeve looked back with the expression of a man who was aware that his answer had probably not been the impressive one that was hoped for. Drakal said nothing for a moment. Then he said, it worked. Yeah, Reeve said. Apparently. He went back to the seal work. Grail leaned slightly forward to watch. Something Reeve was doing with the calibration tool and made a faint, low sound in its throat, not a warning sound, not an aggressive sound. Just a small noise of attention, the kind of sound a person makes when they lean in to look at something more closely. Drakal stood in that bay with his 3 hatchlings and a human mechanic, who smelled like fuel and old work suits, and felt the particular unsettled sensation of someone who had been very certain about how the world worked, and had just found a small piece of evidence that it didn't. He stayed where he was. He kept watching. He had nothing else to do that was more important than this, though he could not yet have said why he felt that so clearly. By the 3rd day, the hatchlings knew the sound of his footsteps. Drakal noticed it on the morning of day 2, a shift in the way they were sitting, a slight lift of all 3 heads before the outer bay door. Even registered an entry code. By day 3 it was unmistakable. Voss was at the door before Reeve opened it, not aggressively, not in the low, coiled posture it used when something was approaching that it didn't like. Just present, waiting, the way it sometimes waited at the ship hatch when Drakal came back from the station corridors after being gone a while. Drakal did not say anything about this to anyone, because there was no one on this station he would have said it to, and also because he was still not sure what it meant. He was a warrior, not a naturalist. He knew the hatchlings the way any bonded keeper knew them in practice, in habit, in the daily language of living alongside creatures who communicated, mostly through posture and sound and the specific quality of their silence. He did not know the theory. He did not know the deep mechanisms of what drove their behavior. He knew that this was not normal. That was enough to keep him watching. Reeve came each day at roughly the same time, which Drakal suspected was less about schedule and more about the man's general consistency. He seemed like someone who did things in a particular order and at a particular pace and did not vary much from it. He came with his tool bag, which had been repaired again since the 1st day. Drakal had noticed a new patch of adhesive tape along the left strap. He came with a drink in a station-issued container that he set on a ledge near the port engine every time, and collected again before he left, and once left behind, and came back for 20 minutes later looking unbothered. He did not try to touch the hatchlings. That was the thing Drakal kept returning to. Every other being who had been in proximity to the hatchlings and not immediately panicked had eventually made some attempt, tentative, curious, compulsive, to reach out a hand. It was as if proximity produced a kind of gravity, a pull toward contact. Even beings who knew better seemed to struggle against it. Reeve did not struggle against it because he did not seem to feel the pull. He worked near the hatchlings the way he worked near the ship's components, aware of them, making adjustments for them, but not oriented toward them in that reaching, wanting way. It was Grail that closed the distance. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, while Reeve was on his back under the port engine housing running a calibration line along the fuel feed, Grail walked over and lay down beside him. Not behind him this time. Beside him. Close enough that its shoulder was about 6 inches from Reeve's arm. It put its head down on its forelegs and made the small attention sound it had been making when it watched his hands work. Reeve went still for a moment. Then he tilted his head just enough to confirm what was there. Then he went back to the calibration line. He did not reach over to touch Grail. He did not say anything to it. He simply continued working with an animal the size of a large hound, lying beside him in the shadow under the engine housing, and treated this as a reasonable state of affairs. Drakal, watching from his usual position near the ship's stern, felt something happen in his chest that he had no immediate name for. It was not a comfortable feeling. It was the feeling of something shifting that had been fixed for a long time, and the motion of it was strange and not entirely welcome. On the 4th day, Drakal started talking. He had not planned to. He was not a person who made plans to talk. He was watching Reeve work on the NAV guidance calibration system, which required lying on the floor of the cockpit with one arm inside a panel, and had been producing periodic sounds of mild frustration for about 40 minutes, and he said, the previous technician who attempted that calibration gave up after an hour and charged me for 2. Reeve said, from inside the panel, it's the secondary alignment ring. Somebody installed it backwards at some point, and every recalibration since has been correcting for the error instead of fixing it. You want me to pull it and reinstall it, right? Drakal said, yes. Reeve said, it'll take most of tomorrow, but it'll actually be fixed instead of patched. Drakal said, fine. There was a pause. Then he said, the hatchling's previous keeper was a young rider named Oren. He named all 3 of them. Reeve didn't say anything for a moment. Then, what do the names mean? Drakal thought about it. Voss means the first wind before a storm. In the old tongue. Cinder is from the human word Oren, like human. Words. He said they sounded like what they described. Grail is a score. Word. Closest translation is something like the last light that stays after sunset. He had a good ear, Reeve said. Yes, Drakal said. He did. The conversation ended there, the way conversations sometimes end when something true has been said and there is nothing that can follow it, without making it smaller. But the fact of it remained in the bay, like warmth from a vent, not dramatic, just present. It was on the 5th day that the pressure coupling failed. Reeve was working beneath the starboard hull section, replacing a section of coolant line that ran along the underside of the ship. Drakal was inside the ship, running a diagnostic. The coupling was part of a stabilizing brace along the hull edge, old, stressed from too many cycles, a slow failure that had probably been building for months. It let go all at once. The section of hull brace it had been holding shifted outward and dropped. Not all the way. There was a secondary catch that stopped the full fall. But it moved fast, and it moved heavy, and Reeve was directly underneath it. Drakal heard the crack of the coupling and was already moving when something else moved faster. Cinder hit the falling brace section with her shoulder. All of her weight, driven forward from a dead standstill, into the side of the falling metal. It stopped. Not neatly. She grunted with the impact, and her claws scraped the floor as she took the weight, but it stopped, and Reeve, who had started to throw himself sideways, found that there was nothing coming down on him anymore. There was a second of complete silence in the bay. Reeve was on his side on the floor, one arm up in the instinctive cover posture, looking at the brace section that was resting against Cinder's shoulder. Cinder was looking back at him, breathing hard from the impact. Her copper scales dusty where she had hit the metal. Reeve slowly lowered his arm. He looked at Cinder for a long time. She looked back with those gold-edged eyes that had stopped glowing with tension on day 2 and had settled into something steadier and calmer, a light that was just there now, just part of how she looked at things. He said, quietly, "Thank you." He did not say it for show. There was no one to show it to. He said it the way a person says something when they mean it and can't think of anything more useful to say. Cinder made a low sound deep in the chest, a vibration more than a noise, and stepped back, letting the brace section settle against the secondary catch where it would stay until Drakal could deal with it properly. Drakal stood in the ship hatchway, and did not move for a long moment. In the 40 years he had worked alongside score dragons in bond service. In battle, in transport and treaty work, he had seen hatchlings bond. He had seen young dragons make their choices, extend their protection, claim a person as theirs in the wordless way they did it, the way that couldn't be arranged or encouraged or asked for. It always looked exactly like this. He went down the ramp and walked to where Reeve was getting to his feet, and he said, "Are you hurt?" Reeve checked his arms, his side. "No, I'm fine." He looked at Cinder. Again, "Is she okay?" She took that pretty hard. Dracal looked at Cinder, who was already moving away, already returning. To her patrol of the bay perimeter, the impact apparently filed away as an event that had concluded satisfactorily. He said, "She is fine." Reeve nodded. He picked up his tools from where they had scattered and started getting back to work. Dracal stood near him and did not return to the ship, and neither of them said anything else, but the silence between them had changed quality slightly, the way the air changes after a storm passes, cleaner, somehow, and easier to breathe. Grail came and lay beside Reeve again as he worked. Voss eventually settled on top of a crate nearby and went to sleep. Cinder continued her circuit of the bay, slower now, unhurried. Her shoulder would bruise. Dracal would check it tonight. But she moved, like something that had done what it meant to do and found the result acceptable. Dracal watched the three of them, the hatchlings and the human, in the quiet of the repair bay and understood that something had already been decided here, that he had not been the one to decide. He was still working out how he felt about that. It was going to take a while. He was not a fast feeler of things. He was a fast fighter and a good keeper and a patient traveler, but feelings had always moved through him like deep water, slow to arrive, slow to leave, and very heavy while they were there. He went to check on the brace coupling. There was still work to do, and work had always been the thing he trusted most. It started with food. Reeve had brought his meal to the bay on the 6th day because the repair work on the NAV guidance ring was at a stage that required him to check the calibration output every 20 minutes, and walking back and forth to the station canteen was not practical. He set it on the same ledge where his drink container always went, a container of something that smelled to Dracal like grain and salt and something faintly green. Dracal had been eating from the ship's stored provisions, and he brought those out too, partly because the repair bay had become, over the past 6 days, the place where he spent most of his time anyway, and partly because something about the way Reeve had set his food on that ledge without ceremony or invitation felt like a version of making space, and Dracal found he was not resistant to the idea. They ate on opposite sides of the bay, which would have looked, from above, like two beings maintaining a careful professional distance. It did not feel like that from inside it. It felt like two people who were comfortable enough in the same space that they did not need to perform closeness to prove it was there. The hatchlings moved between them in their various orbits, Voss patrolling, Cinder watching Reeve's food container with professional interest. Grail settled at the halfway point between the two men like something that had made a decision about where it belonged. Dracal said, "In score tradition, sharing a meal in a claimed space is a form of territory acknowledgement. You should know that if any of my people ever ask what happened in this bay." Reeve looked at his grain container and then at Dracal. "Should I not have brought it in?" "No," Dracal said. "You should have. I am telling you so that you understand what it means." Reeve thought about that for a moment. Then he said, "Okay, what does it mean?" "It means," Dracal said, choosing the words with some care, "that you are recognized here." Reeve nodded slowly. He didn't make anything of it. He didn't look pleased or proud. He just nodded, the way he processed most things, receiving the information and putting it in its place. They ate. The station sounds came through the walls, distant and metallic. A docking alarm somewhere 2 bays over. The regular pressure cycling of the ventilation. The small sounds the hatchlings made, which Dracal had long since learned to hear as a kind of ambient language. Voss's claws on the floor when it changed direction, Cinder's slow breathing when she was settled, the occasional quiet note from Grail that meant it was paying attention to something. It was Reeve who spoke first, after a long, comfortable silence. He said, "How long have you had them?" Drakal said, since they were eggs. About 2 years now, in station time. Were you always going to be their keeper? Or did it work out that way? Drakal was quiet for a moment. It worked out that way, he said. Their rider died. I was there. There was no one else. Reeve said, I'm sorry. Not I'm sorry for your loss, or I'm sorry that happened to you just. The simple 2 words, flat and real, which was somehow better than the larger version. Drakal said, he was 23 years old. He had been in bond service for 8 months. He died covering a civilian retreat during the Veldrath border action. He ran into fire so that 400 beings could run out of it. He had not said that to anyone. He had written it in a service report. He had spoken it as testimony in a formal record. He had said the words in the required contexts, in the official ways. He had not said it like this, plainly, to a person, in a repair bay, over a meal. Reeve looked at him and said nothing, which was the right thing. Then he said, did he know what he was running into? Yes, Drakal said. Then he wasn't surprised, Reeve said. That's something. Drakal considered this. It was not a thing he had thought about before. Not whether Oren had been surprised, not whether the manner of the end had carried any comfort in itself. He had thought about the loss as a fact, as a weight, as a thing to be managed. He had not thought about it as. Reeve had just framed it. No, he said slowly. He was not surprised. Reeve looked at his food. He turned the container in his hands once. A small, restless motion, and then he said, my daughter used to name things. Everything. She named rocks she found interesting. She named a cloud formation she saw 3 days in a row from the viewport and cried when it was gone the 4th day. He paused. She named our shuttle Biscuit. Drakal said, where is she now? She died, Reeve said. Her and her mother both. Merrick Colony, for years ago. The support structure in the lower Habring failed. It was a manufacturing defect, something in the joint alloy that everyone had been using for 15 years and nobody knew was wrong until it wasn't theoretical anymore. He said it without any particular weight. Not flatly, not in the carefully controlled way of someone suppressing something. Just plainly. The way someone says a thing they have said before, that they have already made room for inside themselves because there was nowhere else to put it. Drakal did not say I'm sorry. He sat with it, the way Reeve had sat with his telling. After a moment he said, how old was she? 6, Reeve said. Her name was Ness. In the middle of the bay, Grail stood up. It walked, deliberate and unhurried, across the floor to where Reeve was sitting and climbed carefully, with a kind of conscious gentleness that Drakal had never seen it apply to anything into Reeve's lap. It was almost too large to fit. It made itself fit anyway, tucked its head under Reeve's arm, and went still. Reeve sat there for a moment without moving. Then, very slowly, he put his hand on Grail's side. At the other end of the bay, Voss stopped walking its circuit. It came over to Drakal and leaned against his leg, a thing it did rarely. A thing that was less about comfort-seeking and more about offering some, which was a distinction Drakal had learned to recognize. He put his hand briefly on the top of its head. Cinder had moved to sit directly between the 2 men, equidistant, the way she sometimes positioned herself in the ship when she had decided something needed to be held together. The 4 station walls, the sounds from outside, the lights that had shifted to their lower evening setting at some point without Drakal noticing. 5 beings in a repair bay, 2 of them sitting with the weight of who they had lost, and 3 of them doing what dragons have always done for the people they claimed, sitting with them, not solving anything, not making it smaller, just staying. Drakal said, eventually, Oren would have liked knowing about Ness. He liked people who named things. Reeve looked at him. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite not one. Ness would have liked Grail, he said. She had a thing for animals that looked like they were judging her. Drakal looked at Grail, still tucked under Reeve's arm, looking out at the bay with the specific Grail expression that did, objectively, look like it was conducting a quiet evaluation of everything it saw. He said, Grail judges everything. We have all accepted this. Reeve made a sound short, warm that Drakal recognized, after a moment, as a laugh. Small and real and not performed. The first one he had heard from the man in 6 days. It sounded, in the quiet bay, like a door opening somewhere. Drakal had not expected to feel it the way he did, a loosening, a small release of something that had been held a long time. He did not fully understand it. He was not the kind of being who needed to understand something immediately in order to let it be true. He was old enough and tired enough to have made peace with the things that moved through him. Without explanation, he let it be true, whatever it was. Grail made a low sound against Reeves' arm. Not the attention sound it had been making all week. Something deeper, something that started in the chest and moved through the whole body like a slow bell. Drakal went still. He knew that sound. He had heard it twice before in his life, once when a bonded rider had died and the dragon had mourned, and once when a very old dragon on the sanctuary world had looked at Drakal across a courtyard the first time he visited and made that sound for reasons the keepers there said they had never fully understood. It was called, in the old language, the Grell sound. The closest translation was something like, "I have found what I did not know I was looking for." Drakal sat in the lowered evening light of the repair bay and listened to his youngest hatchling make the Grell sound for a human mechanic who smelled like fuel and had once owned a shuttle named Biscuit, and he felt something in him that was not grief and was not relief, but lived in the neighborhood of both. He did not interrupt it. Some things should not be interrupted. The message came through at the start of the 7th day, while Drakal was still inside the ship. It was flagged priority diplomatic, which meant it had come through the station's formal relay system rather than general comms, and that someone had paid for the priority tag, which meant someone wanted him to know. They meant it. The sender designation read, "Scored Diplomatic Convoy. Aldrich, Senior Envoy, 3rd Circle." Drakal read the message twice. Then he set the comm unit down on the NAV console and sat with it for a while. The message was not long. It said that Senior Envoy Aldrich was passing through Vardon on a transit layover of 4 hours. It said that Aldrich was aware that Drakal was currently docked at Vardon. It said that reports had reached the convoy. Drakal did not spend time wondering how, because on a station with 40 species and twice that many listening ears, information always moved regarding the hatchlings and an interaction with a human maintenance worker. The last line said, "I expect your explanation in person. Earth 7. 1 hour." Aldrich was old guard score in the way that certain rocks are old, not from age alone, but from the kind of pressure that had compressed everything soft out of them over a very long time. He had been a warrior before he was a diplomat, and he had carried the warrior's way of standing, the warrior's way of looking at a room as though he was calculating its weaknesses out of habit. He was not cruel. Drakal had known him for many years and was clear about that. Aldrich was not cruel. He was simply a being for whom tradition was not a choice or a preference, but the actual structure of how the world held together. Drakal went to berth 7. Aldrich's temporary quarters were small and precisely arranged, which was also very Aldrich. He was standing when Drakal came in. He did not offer a seat, and Drakal did not expect one. Aldrich said, "I'll be direct." Drakal said, "Please. Reports say your hatchlings have been in unrestrained proximity to a human station worker for multiple days. Unsupervised contact. Physical closeness." The human touched one of them. He paused. "Is this accurate?" Drakal said, "Substantially." Aldrich's expression did not change much. A tightening around the eyes. "Drakal, these hatchlings were bonded to Orin. Orin died in service. His bond rights transferred to you as keeper pending sanctuary placement, allowing a non-bonded outsider, particularly a member of a species with no recognized standing in scorebond law, to form any kind of connection with those hatchlings is a violation of Orin's memory and an insult to the bond he made." "I understand why it appears that way," Drakal said. "I am not asking for your understanding of my perspective," Aldrich said. "I am telling you what it is. I am also telling you that if this reaches the Bond Council, they will demand the hatchlings be remanded to supervised sanctuary immediately, and your keeper status will be reviewed." The room was quiet for a moment. Drakal said, "Then let me tell you what actually happened." Aldrich waited. "The hatchlings chose him," Drakal said. "Not the other way. The human came to do repair work. He did not approach them. He did not attempt contact. He worked, and they moved toward him, and they have continued to do so every day since. Cinder put herself between a falling hull brace and this man, Aldrich, without my command, on her own instinct and her own decision. Aldrich said, hatchlings do not bond outside the score. No, Dracal said. They don't. And yet. Another pause. Aldrich was a thinker under the rigidity Dracal knew. This had always known this, and he was thinking now he could see it. Working through the conflict between what the rules said and what the reported facts described. Aldrich said, you could have told me it was controlled, supervised, exposure, research into cross-species tolerance. I would have accepted a reasonable framing. Yes, Dracal said. I could have. Why didn't you? Dracal thought about a young man who had run into fire so 400 beings could run out of it. He thought about a mechanic who sat in a repair bay with tools spreading across the floor and named them one by one to himself. He thought about the grell sound, low and slow and true. In the evening light, he said, because Orin never lied to make things easier. He ran toward what was true even when it was hard to run toward. I owe him that much. I will not dishonor his memory with a convenient story that lets me avoid the real one. Aldrich stood very still. This human, he said. What is he to you? He is someone who listened when I talked about Orin, Dracal said. He is someone who lost a child and does not perform his grief. He is someone who sat in a bay with 3 unrestrained hatchlings and did not run, not because he was brave, but because running did not seem to him like the right answer. He paused. He is not score. He is not bonded. He is a human mechanic who smells like fuel and does his work well. And the hatchlings have decided that is enough, and I find that I agree with them. Aldrich was quiet for a long time, long enough that Dracal began preparing for the consequences, the political report, the bond council review, the formal note in his service record. He had accepted them on the way to this birth. He had made his peace with them. Aldrich said, if the bond council asks me what I found here, I will tell them I investigated a report and found no evidence of bond protocol violation. He held Dracal's gaze steadily. Hatchlings behaving unusually in a new environment is not evidence of violation. It is observation. I have observed. I am satisfied. Dracal said, that is not the truth. No, Aldrich said. It is a truth that protects what matters until the bond council is ready to understand the rest of it, which they are not. Not today. He looked out the small berth window at the station's outer ring. Orin was a student of mine before bond service. Did you know that? No, Dracal said. He argued with me about tradition constantly, Aldrich said. He thought rules should follow reality, not the other way around. I told him he was young and would learn better. A pause. I have spent 8 months wondering if I was right. He looked back at Dracal. Go back to your hatchlings. Finish your repairs. Don't give me more reports to investigate. Dracal said, understood. He left berth 7 and walked back through the station corridors toward the repair bay, and he felt not lighter exactly, but more settled, like a ship that has been running with a slight compensating lean for so long that it has forgotten what level trim feels like, and then the weight shifts, and it finds the line it was always supposed to be on. When he reached the bay, Reeve was already there. He was lying on his back under the starboard side, running the last set of checks on the coolant line replacement, and all 3 hatchlings were in there now. Familiar positions, Grail beside him, Voss on the crate that had become its observation post, Cinder on slow circuit of the bay. Reeve slid out from under the hull when he heard Dracal come in. He had a sensor readout in one hand. He said, starboard coolant is clean. The NAV ring calibration is holding. I've got one last check on the fuel cell balance, and then the ship is done. He held out the sensor readout for Dracal to look at. Dracal took it. The numbers were good. Better than good. The ship had not been this clean in 2 years of operation. Dracal said, good work. Reeve said, I'll finish the fuel balance today. You should be clear to leave tomorrow morning. He said it without any inflection of regret and without any performance of casualness that might cover regret. He said it because it was true, and it was his job to say it. Dracal handed the readout back. He looked at the bay, the ship, the hatchlings, the human mechanic with the patch tool bag, and he said, I had a meeting this morning with a senior envoy from my people. About you. About the hatchlings. Reeve looked at him, waiting. It is resolved, Drakal said. There will be no formal problem. Reeve said, was there going to be? Potentially, Drakal said. What has happened here, the hatchlings? Accepting you, the contact, the level of it is not, by my peoples. Tradition, something that should be possible outside a formal bond. There are those who would have called it a dishonor to the memory of the writer, who bonded them first. Reeve was quiet for a moment. Is it, he said, a dishonor? Drakal looked at Grail, who had come to stand near him during this conversation and was now leaning very slightly against his leg, the way Voss leaned when it was offering something. No, Drakal said. It is the opposite of that. Reeve nodded. He went back to the fuel balance check without making any more of it, and Drakal stood in his bay and watched his hatchlings and felt, for the first time in 8 months, that he was not simply enduring the weight of what had happened but beginning, very slowly, to carry it. In a different way, less like a stone tied to him, more like something held in 2 hands, which was still heavy, but was a weight that could be moved. The fuel balance check took less time than expected. Reeve was done by mid-morning of the 8th day. He ran the full diagnostic. Twice, not because he didn't trust the first result, but because he was the kind of person who did things twice when it mattered and considered the extra time a reasonable cost. Both runs came back clean. He wrote the final maintenance report on a station-issue data card in his small, steady handwriting and slid it into his chest pocket and began packing his tools. The bay was very quiet. Voss had been tracking him all morning. Not in the patrol circuit way, not in the tense, assessing way of the first day, just following, at a loose distance, the way it sometimes followed Drakal when he moved through the ship doing checks, like something that had decided where it belonged and was making sure it didn't fall behind. Reeve packed the tools in the order he always packed them, which was the reverse of the order he took them out, a habit he had developed early in his career and kept because it meant he always knew what he had and where it was. Cinder watched the packing from her position near the ship's stern. She had been there for the last hour, moving less than usual, her large copper-colored head following Reeve's movements the way a compass needle follows north. Grail was sitting in the exact center of the bay floor and looking at nothing in particular, which was how it looked when it was thinking. Drakal came down the ship's ramp with his own preparations for departure, visible in the way he moved, the settled purpose of someone who has checked their inventory, confirmed their route, and is in the final hour. Before leaving, he was carrying a cargo case that he set near the outer door, and then he stood and looked at Reeve packing his tools and said, nothing for a while. Then he said, I intended to leave at first light tomorrow, but the ship is ready now. Reeve looked up. You could leave today if you wanted. Diagnostics are clean. Nothing's going to change overnight. Drakal said, I know. He stayed where he was. Reeve finished packing the tool bag and closed the main clasp. He picked it up and held it at his side and looked around the bay the way a person does when they are checking they haven't left anything behind, and also, in some secondary way, just looking. He pulled the data card from his pocket and walked over to Drakal and held it out. Full maintenance report. Everything that was done, what I found, what I fixed, what to watch. The NAV ring should hold indefinitely, but have someone look at the secondary alignment setting in about 6 months just to confirm. Drakal took the card. He looked at it and then put it inside his coat. Thank you, he said. Reeve said, good ship. Under the problems, I mean. Good bones. Drakal said, she has carried a lot. Reeve nodded. He understood that this was not only about the ship. The hatchlings had begun to move. Not toward the ship, toward Reeve. Slowly, without any particular drama, the way things happen when they are already decided, and only the moment of it is left to complete. Voss came first, as it always did, closing the distance with that low-headed, deliberate walk that on the first day had made everyone in its path want to find a wall to stand against. It stopped in front of Reeve. It looked at him. Then it pressed the side of its head against his hand briefly, firmly, the kind of contact that is about delivering something rather than receiving it, like a period at the end of a sentence. Reeves' hand closed slightly around the ridge of scale above Voss's. I for just a second, and then Voss pulled back and walked away toward the ship, up the ramp, done. Cinder came next. She was too large to be graceful about it, she was. Aware of her own size in a way Voss wasn't, and she moved carefully, making herself smaller through the deliberateness of her approach. She did not press her head against him. She stood in front of him and made a sound that Drakal had heard before from older dragons, but never from a juvenile, a deep, measured vibration that you felt more than heard. He knew what it was. He had not expected to hear it from her yet. It was called the Grell Vorth, a completing sound. If the Grell sound was, I have found what I did not know I was looking for, then the Grell Vorth was its answer. I will carry this with me. It was what a dragon said to a loss it was choosing to hold, rather than release. Cinder was young. He hadn't known she understood it yet. She held the sound for 3 seconds, and then stepped back and followed Voss up the ramp. Grail came last. Grail stood in front of Reeve for a long moment, and simply looked at him, with those steady eyes that seemed always to be calculating something just on the other side of what you could read. Then it did something Drakal had never seen any of them do. It looked at Reeve. Then it looked at Drakal. Then it looked at Reeve. Again, back and forth, once each, deliberate and clear, like something being said in a language that didn't have words yet, but was trying its best with the ones it had. Then it turned and walked up the ramp and was gone. The bay was quiet in a new way after that. Not empty, just settled. Drakal said, Grail is not subtle. Reeve said, no. His voice was steady. His eyes were on the top of the ramp where Grail had disappeared. Drakal said, you did not try to be remarkable. I want you to know that. I understand that. That it was not a strategy. You simply came to work. And you were who you are. And that was the thing they responded to. Reeve looked at him. You could have lied to that envoy, he said. It would have been easier. Yes, Drakal said. Why didn't you? Drakal had answered this question already in Birth 7, and the answer had come from somewhere quick and clean, the way true answers do. He gave it again without changing it. Because Oren ran toward what was true, even when it was hard. I owe him that much. I will not pay his memory with a comfortable lie. Reeve was quiet for a moment. He sounds like someone worth knowing, he said. He was, Drakal said. He would have liked you. He had strong opinions about people who showed up and did the work without needing anyone to watch them do it. A small sound from Reeve. Not quite a laugh. Something close to it, and honest. Drakal picked up the cargo case near the door. He held it for a moment, looking at the mechanic who had come to fix a ship and had, without intending to, or even being aware that he was doing it, changed something in this bay that had needed changing for a long time. He said, the sanctuary world where I am taking them, they have keepers there, experienced ones, who will help Cinder and Voss and Grail find their way. I am told it is a good place. He paused. I will tell the keepers what happened here, what the hatchlings chose. They should know it. Reeve said, tell them Grail is a good judge of things. I will, Drakal said. I will tell them exactly that. He went up the ramp. At the top he stopped and looked back, the way he rarely did, because looking back was something he had trained out of himself over 40 years for practical reasons, and yet Reeve was standing in the bay with his tool bag at his side and his hand at his coat front where the badge was that said his name and his station and his job, and he was looking up at the ship the way a person looks at something they are choosing to remember. Drakal held up one hand, open, palm outward. The score gesture for, I have seen you. It was not a farewell exactly. It was closer to an acknowledgement, a formal recognition of the fact that a thing was real. Reeve raised his hand in return, the simple human mirror of it, open, palm, and that was that. Drakal went inside. The ramp closed. The ship's engines began their warm-up cycle, low and steady. Reeve stood in the bay while the pre-departure checks ran and the docking clamps disengaged one by one with the solid concussive sounds of large mechanical things releasing their hold. He did not move toward the door. He stayed where he was. The ship lifted on its stabilizers, hovered for a moment in the bay's center, and then the outer doors opened and the dark beyond them was the particular dark of space, which is not empty, only large, and the ship moved through and was gone. The outer doors sealed. The bay returned to silence. Reeve stood in it for a while. He had no reason to stay. He stayed anyway. Because sometimes you stand in a place after a thing is over, not because there is anything left to do there, but because leaving feels like it. Needs a moment of its own. His comm buzzed. Work order, berth 12, something wrong with the cargo. Lift. He looked at it. He picked up his tool bag. He walked out of the bay and back into the station corridor, which was full of its usual noise and motion, beings moving in all directions on all their various purposes, and nobody paid him any particular attention. As he walked, he was a maintenance worker on a mid-grade transit station. He was nobody's story. He walked through it all and felt, in some way he could not have put words, to a quiet and solid thing, like a room that has been cleaned and set straight and left with good light in it. He had not expected to be chosen by anything again. He had made his peace with that, or believed that he had, which is often as close as a person gets. But grief has its own grammar, and sometimes across species, across silence, across all the cold and endless distance of space it recognizes itself. And in the recognizing, something that was only lost becomes, without quite announcing it, something that is also survival. Reeve went to fix the cargo lift.